he got fogged in Canberra this morning, which meant he missed his ongoing flight from Melbourne to Perth, but he managed to get here, found a taxi driver who actually went to Curtin University and knew his way around, and it's fantastic that Allan's come. You would have noticed from the note we sent around, Allan's had a pretty stellar career in all sorts of public service areas. I didn't realise it went back quite so far. I had a look at his LinkedIn page, and I know he's currently, of course, at the Australia Institute as their, what's his current title? What's your current title? Head of International and Security Affairs Program. But many of you may know him. He's actually written a book, which I've read half of, and now will finish it, on No Minister, about being a Chief of Staff. It's probably too late for me. I was a Chief of Staff to a Minister, so it's a bit of a waste of time for me reading that now. If I'd only read it back then, I would have known what to do. But I was Chief of Staff to a couple of ministers in my time, so I should have read that a long time ago. So Allan, sorry you didn't write that back in the early 80s, but anyway, there you go. But apart from that, he started off as a diplomat, spent 8 years in the diplomatic service, and then spent many years both in defence, Attorney General Department. He also went out and worked in consultancy, came back and was Chief of Staff to Greg Conway, which obviously spawned his earlier book. And he's also worked with Penny Wong and has been in various other roles, in fact as CEO of PTSD Australia New Zealand. So he's had a wide career and varied career. I've just finished reading his book this afternoon. It really is a pleasure to read, very interesting, lots of interesting ideas, both combination of history as well as current thinking about how Australia might want to conceive of what security even means, as well as its relations with its region and the wider world, as well as its relationship with itself. And so it's just a great pleasure to have Allan Behm here tonight to speak to us. The format, he will speak for, I don't know, 25, 30 minutes or however long it takes, and then we'll have Q&A. I was mentioning to him, it's a bit like the United Nations here, because when you ask your question, you can press the little button in front of you and get the microphone. So you can be the congressman or the representative from whatever country you wish to be, and you can ask the question. And the reason I would ask you to do that when we do Q&A is because we're filming it through the Curtin iLecture system. We'll then edit it down and put that up on our website for people who couldn't attend. So Allan, once again, thank you very much for coming over to Perth to give the presentation. We're really looking forward to hearing from you.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I too join with John in recognising the original owners of the lands on which we're meeting tonight, the First Peoples of Australia, and pay my respects too to their elders, past, present, and to those who are emerging as leaders of the First Peoples of Australia. I'm going to get back onto that subject a little, in not too distant time from now, but I just think it is very important that we recognise that this fabulous continent on which we all live has had a living and continuous culture for over 65,000 years, and it's something, not only should we recognise it, but we should be immensely proud of that. And I think very deeply about some of the things that might have occurred since 1788. I'm going to get onto that too. Yes, I got held up in Canberra this morning because it was foggy, I was told. I didn't see the fog. Just as we're not match fit as travellers anymore, anybody who happened to read Rick Morton's piece in the Saturday paper last weekend would work out that Qantas is not match fit either. And so I spent 6 happy hours sitting around at the Melbourne Air Terminal after I did get there. And so I roll up here looking what you would probably imagine people from the eastern states look like. Dishevelled, in need of a good shower, and just generally the riffraff who seem to make it over here from there. Anyway, it's wonderful to be here again. I haven't been here for 10 years. Very nice to see Greg Martin here. Now, we have worked together, and that was in 1990 when I was head of the National Counter-Terrorism System in Australia. And we put on an international conference here in Yanchep City, or at least a big hotel there, and I can't remember the name of it now, but I certainly remember Greg because it was a perfectly run conference. And all I had to do was pay for it. But it was good. So this book, I'm here because tomorrow in the afternoon, the Governor is going to launch my book in Western Australia. I worked very closely with Kim when he was Minister for Defence. We have been good friends ever since, and I'm just so proud that that he has agreed to launch my book, and I'm equally proud that my book was actually published here in Perth by Upswell and by a woman who many of you would know, Terry Ann White, who is just the most wonderful publisher. And she's got a great team that she hires in, and so the production values of that book I'm really, really pleased with. Let me explain the cover though. I don't need it, mate, I've seen it before. When the cover design came, it was exactly like that, except it had a beautiful sort of bluey-green background behind what some people would see as chess pieces, pawns, and what other people will see as two faces, because it is meant to be an illusion. And I gave it to my wife and my daughter and said, hey, what do you think of this? And they said, oh, that's lovely, but the girls won't read it. I said, why not? I wrote it for them. They said, no, they wouldn't pick up a book that looks like a boy's book. So I said, all right, we'll just change the background colour into Schiaparelli pink. And that's what that is. And I actually did write it for women, for reasons I'm about to tell you. It's written for women between the ages of 25 and 40. And since I know there's not one woman in the room here who's over the age of 40, it's for you too. So let's get down to business. I've been in the security game since 1972, when I joined the Department of Foreign Affairs. That was at the time of the McMahon government. And I had a really interesting and good year in my first year, because I was working in a thing called the Policy Planning Group, and the Vietnam War was still on, and the work I had to do was about, you know, what happens after the Vietnam War? Where's Southeast Asia going to go? Where are we going to go? And I wrote, along with my colleagues, about a 15,000-word sort of essay on how we might think of our future and the future of Southeast Asia once we got out of what was not a terribly successful adventure. And one of the readers was a senior minister in the McMahon government that some of you might recall. His name was Sir John Cramer. Does that name ring a bell with anybody? Oh, what a pity. It does with at least one or two. He should be entirely forgotten. But because he wrote on what I thought was a pretty interesting piece, he wrote, what utter bullshit. Why do we pay these people to do this sort of... It was pretty offensive, I thought, because I'd had a nice set of thoughts. But, and so after that, I went on and did some things in the diplomatic service. I was an advisor to Prime Minister Fraser on security matters. I was in the Department of Defence as head of strategy and head of international policy. I was in the Attorney General's Department as head of the National Security Division. After I finished with the Department of Defence eventually, I ran my own business. And just for reasons unknown, but time will tell, I found myself as Greg Combay's Chief of Staff because he couldn't find anybody more stupid than me to do that job. It was a very hard job, as you'll recall, because we were trying to transact a climate policy, which the Abbott government just totally repealed and destroyed the policy, and we're living with the consequences of that right now, particularly on the eastern seaboard, because the failure of the NEM is a direct result of not having a carbon price back there 12 years ago. So, having got back to working with Penny and writing some speeches for her, and having sort of cashed in my chips just before the 2019 election, I thought I'd go and think about answering this question. Why is it that Australia is so comprehensively good at getting things so comprehensively bad? And leaving aside some successes, we're not a totally unsuccessful country, but in the field of foreign policy and security policy, we're actually pretty pedestrian. Our big successes are generally historical. They were a long time ago. Curtin, I notice his library is just across the way here, and the most beautiful xanthorrhoeas I've seen for some time, by the way. It's a beautiful garden you've got outside. Curtin saw that Australia, in its dependence on the United Kingdom, ran the risk of being overrun. And so we could no longer rely on a great protector, and we had to fend for ourselves, which is why the 7th Division had to come back from the Middle East. Some of them came back to Australia. My dad was included in those, and some of them came back to Singapore. And the ones who went to Singapore didn't have such a very good time. And the ones who came back to Australia didn't have a much better time because they all went up into the Papua New Guinea and then into Indonesia. Curtin sort of enlisted the services of the United States, and since then we've been a dependent of the United States instead of being a dependent of Britain. We've had a few signal triumphs in foreign policy, but they're few and far between. A couple in trade policy. I think the formation of the Cairns Group was a really great success for Australia. But by and large, we have not been able to capitalise on the many talents that we have. And so what I have done in this book is try to explain why is it that we have not been able to capitalise on the many strengths that we've got. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to touch the half a dozen reasons that I think explain why we haven't been able to do what we should have been able to do. Then I'm just going to say a little bit about the nature of our national power, and we have a lot of it, by the way, a huge amount of it, but most of the time we don't realise how much power we've got. And then I'm just going to offer a few remarks about what sorts of things a government might do to have us cut the mustard better than we have already. So where my book begins is with an examination of a set of 6 pathologies that deeply limit our agency as a nation. And I rank them not in priority order, but in the order in which I think they do the most damage. So the first one that I think so limits our capacity to demonstrate our agency as a nation is a very fundamental racism in our country, which I think constrains everything we do, everything, because it's so deep and so structural. And that's why it is so important to think about the fact that our continent is the continent which housed the only long-term living culture in the world for 65,000 years. What's that, 2,500 generations? And ever since the day Captain Cook landed, actually, I mean, he had a bit of practice coming through New Zealand, you might know. He shot 6 Maori over there. So the moment they got to Botany Bay, they got out their muskets and fired off a few rounds at the naked men running around with stones and sticks. Didn't kill them very happily, but did hit them with buckshot, which is a pretty warm greeting, really, isn't it? When you meet people for the first time, you get out your gun and shoot at them. Could have been America, I suppose. But the point that I'm making here is that from the very beginning, the people who lived here for such a long time were just seen as other. And we have a strong sense of otherness in this country. People who don't look, dare I say it, like me and like many of us in the room, evidently immigrants, we have a strong sense of people who don't look like us. And racism is very, very profound. And the fact that we find an incapacity to be able to resolve or reconcile or remediate or whatever the right R word is, coming out of the fabulous statement from the heart, which is a beautiful statement, really, that we can't accommodate that, and that Turnbull, as Prime Minister, turned it around immediately and said, no, we're not going to do that, just draws our attention once again to the fact that we are not able to make that really very fundamental rapprochement. When I was writing about that, I had the very good fortune to have a daughter who was, for last year, the associate to one of the federal court judges who works on native title judgments. His name is Mr Justice Stephen Raries of the federal court, and he's based in Sydney. And Stephen took my daughter up to 2 of his judgments, one in far north Queensland, which is where I come from, and one in far northern New South Wales. And I remember she rang me one Sunday afternoon. She said, "Do you think the first peoples of Australia believe in God?" And I said, "Does it matter?" She said, "Well, they're all very spiritual, you know." I said, "Yeah, I do know that bit." "Well, if you're very spiritual, do you have to believe in God?" And I said, "Well, I don't think so. I don't think it's normative that you believe in God and in order to be spiritual. You know, have you got a T-shirt which says, 'I believe in God as much as God believes in me'?" Because belief's an interesting word, isn't it? So we talked on a bit about the nature of the spirituality which ties so many First Peoples to the land. And for me at least, as I'm sure for many of you, the penny dropped. That immigrant people like me have such a strong sense of ownership. We own things. I mean, we come from the Roman law tradition. My background, by the way, was in classics. So I know Cicero pretty well. And Cicero was a pretty great advocate, actually, very good barrister. But the Roman law tradition tells us all about ownership. Ownership is an alien concept for the First Peoples of Australia because they belong. They have such a powerful sense of belonging. And I've now discussed this with many of the Indigenous peoples who live on the south coast of New South Wales, because I go there a lot. And it's fascinating to talk about what belonging really means, that they have no sense that they own country, that they're part of country, they belong to it. And that's something which, if we understood, we would have fabulous agency coming from that. We'd look after our continent in the same way as the First Peoples think that the continent looks after them. That symbiosis of people in the continent, because they see the continent as a living thing, all of it as a living thing, drives a fabulous spirituality. Now, we christened a lot of them, and Pat Dodson was a former priest. I don't think he advertises that too much these days, but if you look at his CV, the sort of tertiary education he had was in a seminary, and good luck to him. So the issue around indigeneity and race is a really important one that we haven't settled. And my argument is, if we knew how to settle that, we would be a very unusual country globally. Very few countries have ever done it. The Kiwis are on the path to it. North America, absolutely nothing like it at this point. And some of the Scandinavian people with their Sami Indigenous people, they've learned how to do it too. But I'm just suggesting that if we could solve that bit, we would be a much more authoritative country than we are now. The second one, the second one is not going to surprise any of you either, and it's the structural misogyny, which I think also vitiates our country. And it is deeply structural. Whenever you hear somebody say, "Oh, but some of my best friends are women," you know immediately that there is a structural issue at play. And were we able to address that squarely, then by remediating racism and remediating structural misogyny, we would be well on the way to having a totally liberated community. And it's not that blokes liberate women. No, that's not how you solve structural misogyny. It's women liberating themselves. They have to liberate us too. They've got to liberate males as well. Now, I'm blessed with 2 daughters and a son, and my 2 daughters are very, very liberated young women. But many of their friends are not. And the nature of structural misogyny is that it's impossible very often for women to get outside the boundaries that tie women down and in. And the same is completely true in the way in which we run our parliament. I mean, I've worked in the parliament on and off for over 50 years. And there have been some improvements, but the problem has not been fixed. Not been fixed by a long chalk. And until we tackle that, not just in our parliament, but everywhere else, until the idea of gender equality translates all the way into pay equality, equality of opportunity, equality of workloads, equality of what happens in families, not just having an equal number of judges in the federal court, which we haven't got, or an equal number of judges in the High Court, which we haven't got. They're important enough tokens, but that's what they are. The real problems are deep in the structures of our society. I came out of the diplomatic service. Some of you in the room might know Sue Boyd. She's a Western Australian, former diplomat. Sue had all of the capacities to get to the very top of her profession. Did she? No. Frances Adamson, who's now the Governor of South Australia, she did. She was the first one. And now we have a Major General as head of the Foreign Service, which is a bit odd. So, misogyny, that was my second one. The third one is a complex of things which come from remoteness, which is an asset actually, but one of the consequences of being remote, and I come from a very remote part of Australia, which is up on the Gulf of Carpentaria, just a little bit north of the Starton River, for those of you who are into a bit of Australian geography. It's a very remote part of the land, I can tell you, and it's a beef cattle place. One of the things that can happen to you if you come from a remote place is you can experience isolation. And isolation and remoteness are not the same thing at all. You know, the hermit, Simon Stylites, sat up on a pole somewhere in Iraq for 50 years, and he was remote, but he was never isolated. He was travelling on mushrooms of some kind, I think, and had many manifestations of the vision of God. But the point I'm making is that isolation plays with your mind. And our national isolation makes us insecure, uncertain of ourselves, and needing a protector. Now, I'd like to suggest to you that having a protector is about the worst position you can be in, because, again, you can't exercise your agency. You look to your protector all the time to provide you with the guidance that you need simply to exercise your agency. The next one that I found really interesting in this is the fact that apart from insecurity and the need for a protector, we don't have a capacity for what I call self-affirmation as a nation. Now, that's got a different expression, which many of you will know. Paul Keating used to use it quite a lot. He used to just call it the cringe. But it comes from an expression which was written in Meanjin back in 1948, I think, where a guy called A.A. Phillips, who was an English master at one of Melbourne's private schools, described it as Australia's cultural cringe, where in order to get affirmation, we had to go somewhere else. We had to go to England, or we had to go to the United States. And now we will go to England or the United States or Europe. We find it very hard to think that we should go to anywhere in Asia for affirmation. How many people doing their PhDs on scholarship from Australia would go to an Asian university? A few will go to a Japanese university these days because they're doing Japanese studies, but how many would do a higher degree in engineering at a Japanese university? Wouldn't we rather go to MIT? And that's still part of the whole thing about looking for affirmation. We find it hard to self-affirm. And so if those things are all playing together, is it any surprise that we don't display the sort of agency that we should be able to display in a world which also so often lacks agency? We sometimes say the world lacks leadership. There's a leadership deficit. There's a trust deficit. And that's true. But the principal reason for that, they're consequences of things. The cause of it is that in order to have those things, you have to be self-affirming. So what is it that you have that drives your agency? So that's what I get onto in about the middle parts of the book. I've got a lot in there about China because I don't think we know enough about China, and it's a reductionist, potted history. I'm sure that John will give me about 2 out of 10 for that chapter, but I just felt that as a country, we crap on about China all the time, about how fearful it is and how they're going to go, we need to go to war with them. And if we don't do that, they'll come to war with us and kill us. Jim Molan, who's a senator, Conservative senator, a former Major General, he's a very good friend of mine actually. Jim has an interesting remark. Who wants to go to war with China? If we were to do that, we'd only last 3 days. To which I respond, well, why don't we double our defence vote? Then we'll last 6 days. Well, you know it doesn't work like that. We'd last 9, probably. The whole point is that you cannot think like that. So what is it that you have agency about? And what I then try to do in the middle part of the book is to say that you have agency about some quite fundamental things, and they are the nature of national power, and I want to suggest to you all that we have a huge amount of it. We just don't know it. That identity, which is a critical issue, and values, they're the things that then motivate, they drive your agency. So you take all of the barriers to agency away, and you've got to then recognise what it is that actually fires you up. What's the fuel for your agency? On national power, I'm a very unapologetic supporter of Hans Morgenthau's thinking about national power. Some of you may have come across a fabulous book. It came out just after the Second World War. It's called Politics Among Nations. It is a magisterial book, really. It's a truly wonderful book. He was essentially the founder or the father of realism, as we now understand it to be, in international relations studies. And he identified 8 heads of national power. And on on 7 of them, Australia ranks really high. Really, really high. On 1 of them, it doesn't. Now, I could ask you all just to have a guess which one it is, but that's not fair because you don't know what the other 7 are. So I'm going to tell you the one that we don't count on, and then I'm going to tell you most of the others that we do count on. The one we don't count on is population. It's very hard to have really significant national power based on a population of 25 million. It's pretty hard to do that. Our population is about 55th in the populations of the world. Now just bear that in mind. How many countries are there in the UN? Just under 200. Now, we sometimes describe ourselves as a middle-ranking power. Anybody know which countries are around 98, 99, 100? There are 3 actually, they come all together, they're one after another. And when I tell you what they are, you'll say, I should have thought of that. Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia. Very small populations, not insignificant countries at all, by the way, particularly if you're into music. Arvo Pärt is one of my favourites. They're very talented people, but they're too small to be able to have a huge amount of heft. And so they've been dominated by Russia for a long time, and they've been dominated by Germany at various points, by Sweden at other points, because they're small, but they've maintained their identity. They speak their own languages, as the Finns have, for instance. So population's the one on which we're weak, but the others, we're not weak at all. As Paul Keating said, not very many people got a continent when they were being handed out. You know, that your land mass is an enormous source of your power. Enormous source of power. Next to that is your natural endowments, your resource base. What do I need to say in Western Australia? And I mean, that's only iron ore at the moment. I mean, everybody thinks immediately of iron ore and Pilbara and Roy Hill and all of that. But look at all the other things that you're doing in Western Australia. I mean, where's our energy future going to come from? And we've got some massive lithium mines starting up in Western Australia. We've got massive mines for so many other things that go to the heart of where modern post-industrial economies are going to work. Our resource base is enormous. Our agricultural base is enormous. And people will say, well, we don't have much water though. And there's a bit of truth in that. But even less do we have brains in dealing with the water that we have got. And particularly on the eastern seaboard, where we just send it down, well, where I live, we just send it down the Murrumbidgee River. Every bit of water in Canberra is only used once. If you get water in Paris, it's been through the kidneys of at least 10 other people before you get it. I mean, you've got to use those sorts of resources carefully, but we're blasé about that. Our industrial base is a pretty sophisticated industrial base, actually. I mean, we've had a big car industry until we didn't. We can build submarines. Not a lot of countries can do that. We used to be able to build warships, but that project's not going very well at the moment. We may build submarines again. I don't think we'll build cars again much, but we still have a very significant industrial base. And it's not the heavy industry around mining. That's not an industrial base. It's the industrial base that goes to support where post-industrial economies go. And why do we have that? Because we have a really powerful education sector. I'd not been to your university before. I've been to Crawley many times, but I hadn't been here. It's bloody gorgeous. I mean, I was just gobsmacked to come in and end up in this building. I happen to love xanthorrheas, and they've got most beautiful ones out the front here. I mean, I'd come and study here just for the xanthorrheas, I think. But it's a bit late for me, I think, John, isn't it? But, and I'm proving it. But the point is that we have a fabulous education system, and most particularly in the tertiary sector. Just last month, actually, we had the International University rankings come out again. Was anybody, apart from me, astonished that we have 4 universities in the top 100? Now, that's not the top 100 in the English-speaking world. That's the top 100 in the world. And we've got 2 more banging on the door. Don't you think it is a remarkable thing to have 6 universities in a population of 25 million people which are in the top 100 in the world? That is power, actually. That is power, because it's this bit of the anatomy that drives that. What about our cities? If you look at the tables of international cities from the point of view of amenity, habitability, ease of getting around, how work and life can be balanced nicely, whether you freeze to death in the winter. You might think you freeze to death in Canberra in the winter, and I think that too, actually, but it's not really that bad. That you can survive the summers pretty well in most Australian cities. It gets pretty hot sometimes over here. It gets hot in Melbourne sometimes. But on issues of amenity, habitability, just the general sort of Gemütlichkeit of our Australian cities, we've got 4 that are in the top 10. And even the city I come from, on some measures, fits in the top 10. On some measures, Canberra's not big enough. But there's certainly a lot of amenity in the city in which I live. I mean, it's a privilege for people like me. I was educated in Melbourne and came, as I said, from the very far north of Australia. It's a privilege to be able to live in a city like Canberra with a great university and all of the institutions there. It is a privilege. But it's a privilege to live here because Perth is one of them. Melbourne and Sydney everybody thinks of, but Perth is the most glorious city. I haven't been here for 10 years, but just coming in this afternoon. It's lovely and green at the moment. It's hard to believe it's Perth, but it's just fantastic. That's a sign of power. What about social cohesion? I mean, social cohesion is one of Morgenthau's qualitative instruments of power. And I can criticise, and we can all criticise, the fact that we're racist bastards and we have structural misogyny. Nonetheless, comparatively, have a look at how the rest of the world operates. There are some countries which are ahead of us in inclusion and inclusiveness. That is true. The United States is not one of them. Britain is not one of them. France, most of the Europeans are not there. The Scandinavians used to be, but they're starting to slip for reasons that you are all perfectly well aware of. So even on a matter like that, we have considerable amount of national power. But all of those things we don't really think about. You know, we feel apologetic for going to the G20 when we're the 13th biggest economy in the world. That is not insignificant. Our economic power is incredibly significant. We're not a G7 country, and we never will be now. We once were a G2 country at the end of the 19th century. Melbourne was built on the fact that we were a richer country than Switzerland, per capita, or Britain at the time. But we're 13th. Is anybody in the room surprised to know that in this coming financial year, Australia's economy will be bigger than that of Russia? It's just worth pausing for a moment and thinking about that. I mean, Russia takes decisions about the use of its national power. It invests in nuclear weapons, the systems of warfare, and that's about it. Nobody goes to Moscow State University to study unless you're interested in advanced pure mathematics or chess. And if you are unfortunate enough to travel around in Russia by car, you've got to take about 20 sets of tyres with you because they don't really have roads in Russia. Whereas you can travel anywhere in this country. I mean, we invest in our infrastructure. It's an entirely different concept. So just worth thinking about that. So power. Now I'm going to move quickly just to touch on two things. Identity, or three actually. Identity, interests and values, because they're in the middle bit of the book. Identity is a fraught question in Australia, and I have a good look at that because I think we've had a phony debate about identity for a long time, driven largely through the culture wars, which began immediately that Mr. Howard was elected in 1996. And identity has turned into a concept of division, not a concept of inclusion. Identity comes from the Latin word idem, which means the same. And yet that's not what identity is at all. What has happened in Australia is we've begun to think that identity is something that makes us all the same, but that's a brand. I mean, we can all have a brand on us if we like. We could have the Australian flag tattooed across our foreheads and tell everybody that we're Australian if that's the identity that we think matters. But it's not. The identity that matters is driven by how you appreciate the value structures that actually generate identity. Now, there's a very good book that's just come out, and I'm halfway through it, by a woman called Julianne Schultz. Does anybody know her book? The Idea of Australia, it's called. All right, it's a left-wing book, and it's talking about black armband theories of history and all that sort of stuff. But it doesn't mean she hasn't got some very powerful insights into it about identity. And the most important thing about identity is that each of us has one, and it's not the same as anybody else's. And what gives us a fabulous identity is that we actually have 25 million of it. We've got a brand as well. But the identity should more and more be driven by the values, and values are not hard to come to an agreement on. There was a tiresome debate between Kim Beazley and John Howard at one stage about values, and on one side it was sort of, on Kim's side it was sort of sentimental really, and on Howard's side it was sort of romantic. And the only thing that they could agree on really was that a real Australian value is mateship. Anybody ever tried to use the word mate in one of the First Nations communities? It's not a word that First Nations people use at all. First Nations people use the word bro, which I think they've got that from Maori. And I don't know where the Maori got it from, probably from rappers. But it is an interesting thing that mateship is actually exclusionary when you think about it. So values have got to be much more about the things that give us our identity, and they should be things around inclusion and caring, compassion, tolerance, equity, the things that make us, I hope, the sorts of people that we are, and should make us the sort of nation that we are. And interests, it's often said by people in the political sciences that if you've got a bit of a clash between your interests and your values will always go out the window. Well, can I just say to you immediately that anyone who says that is talking unadulterated bullshit to you. because it's a false or confected binary. It's a trick, it's a logical trick that people like me are really good at playing, and politicians are excellent at it. That you just get two things and you put them in a binary and you'd say, well, here it is, you can choose between Washington and Beijing. There you are, there's a nice binary, it makes it hard, doesn't it? Or you can, I mean, there are all sorts of binaries, it's just done all the time as a way of oversimplifying an issue and forcing you to make a choice, which is never a choice that you would make in any sort of real life. You just do it in your head. Isaiah Berlin was, I think, one of the great philosophers of the 20th century. And he wrote a really wonderful essay, sometime in the 50s, I think, on Machiavelli. And in that essay, he makes the point that the real clashes, when you're confronting interests and values, are between interests and between values. That's where the clashes are. So your values might on the one hand be generosity, and on the other hand it might be parsimony, or greed even. I mean, love might be a value, but its counter value is hate. That the binaries lie within the same category, not between categories. Categories don't compete. And it's a very important thing to remember, because when you're talking about interests and values and identity, it's so often that they're put to you as though you make choices between them. And you don't. They're simply domains within which you as an individual live your life. So that's what the middle part of the book's about. Well, how does this awful confection end? And in the end, towards the end, I start talking about how if we addressed issues around those sort of problems that we've got, and if we were to think a bit more deeply around interests and identity and values, that should take us to a point, and think about our national power, that should take us to a point where instead of going around apologising for things, we suddenly have a capacity to self-affirm. That we have a measure of national confidence, which means that we don't need a protector. Which means that we are self-energising in making our decisions. We don't make our decisions as a reflex of decisions made by others. Now, from 1788 through to 1942, we made all of our decisions as a reflex of British decisions. Hugh White has, it comes out next Monday, his next quarterly essay comes out on Monday, and I read it coming over this afternoon because I'm comparing a session in Canberra on Tuesday night dealing with Hugh's most recent quarterly essay. And Hugh made the point, which I didn't really understand, that when Britain decided to go to war in 1914, Australia was in there barracking, get in there, we've got to sort the world out. Saying all the things that we seem to imagine that Sir John Grey, the Foreign Secretary in London, wanted us to say. And certainly after the war, Billy Hughes was a total pest. And as I point out in my book, some of the consequences of Billy Hughes's mischief we paid high prices for between 1942 and 1945. Not least of all in the translation of the German Pacific territories into the ownership of Japan. So a lot of those really bloody battles that were fought, the Japanese occupied the former German territories in the Pacific. So what I do in that last part is start talking about once you have a society which is inclusive, where women fully occupy every position, every job, do everything that a nation needs to have done, where Indigenous people and immigrant peoples are fully connected in a single vibrating, resonant community, where we can affirm ourselves for the strengths that we have and then go and deal with the deficiencies that we might have. When we can do those things, we cut an entirely different figure. We're not patronising anymore. If you've got self-possession and self-affirmation, you don't use expressions like our Pacific family. whenever you hear the word our put in front of another collective noun, turn on your radar and load your guns, because you know you're about to be hosed with a fair bit of bullshit. Because what you're doing is extending a kind of patronage over those whom you're calling our. I shrivel when I hear people talk about our Indigenous community, our Pacific community. And the first thing you do when you talk about our Pacific community is you condescend and patronise. Oh, and by the way, if you're going to give a speech about our Pacific community, what better place to give it in than Laverack Barracks in Townsville, a military establishment in Townsville named after a slave trader. And do you think the people in the Pacific don't know about Robert Towns? Do you think they don't know about John Mackay, after whom Mackay in Queensland is also named? These people were the shippers of people from Vanuatu and the Solomons and the other Pacific islands who came to Australia and eventually were our first resettlement peoples. So Samuel Griffith in Queensland organised that. And for those of you who don't know, it was done in a very brilliant accounting way, because the Queensland government didn't want to pay for all of those indentured labourers, as they were called, to go back to the Pacific. What had happened is that when they were paid, all of their monies went into a trust. So the Queensland government legislated that the trust would be used to repatriate. So they came, they worked for a pittance, that pittance was put in a trust and they paid for their own repatriation. Now that is a really interesting way of being able to manage a problem. So what the book then, as I say, it comes to the conclusion that we need to address those things, and on the basis of that, of being a much more self-contained country, a country at home with itself, we, instead of getting out there and pointing the finger, we're actually able to advocate the kinds of things that would actually build for a better society, for a better community, for a better world. And you might think, well, how would you do that? Well, just think about the way in which our conversation about China has gone over the last couple of years. Lots and lots of finger pointing. You know, they've got all these people that they've locked up in Xinjiang province. They're Uyghurs, they're Muslims, they're treating them badly, they're taking their children away, they're putting them in institutions. Mind you, the Brits did the same in South Africa and from 1893 onwards, but we don't remember much about that. My grandfather was interned in the First World War. We don't remember much about that. My family does, though. So we look at China and we tell China what's wrong with it. What's wrong with China? Well, Australia will tell you. The much better diplomatic approach is to actually tell the Chinese what's right with us and that it works for us. You know, if you want to have a society with amenity where something like well-being is not a dirty word, and where you could actually say happiness in an economic statement, mind you, it's written in the Declaration of Independence, so if the Americans could do it, why couldn't we? If you want to talk about things like that, you've got to demonstrate them, you've got to live them, you've got to act them. And what I'm suggesting is that our leaders need to be able to represent the kind of country that we are, not tell other countries the kinds of countries that they should be. And that's not an original thought, by the way. Some of you might know or have read some of the writings, and I'm going to end here, of my very, very good friend, because he taught me at the ANU for a short while, Professor Wang Gongwu. Any of you know Professor Wang Gongwu? He's in Singapore now. He was born in Ipoh, taught in Hong Kong for many years. He's very old now, he's in his early 90s. He wrote in 1983 a really powerful insight which said, Australia would do well to walk confidently and say very little, because its neighbourhood would really like to be the sorts of countries that Australia is. And the best way to create that is just to do it. And I think there's a lot of truth in that, walking the talk. But what we do is talk what we don't walk. And that, I think, would completely flip the way in which we manage our agency, and instead of making us a country which is not ugly enough to have any enemies and not pretty enough to have any friends, we wouldn't be ugly, we would be pretty, we wouldn't have enemies, but we would have friends. And that's essentially what I tried to do in that book. Look, thank you all very much for enduring this. I love this room. It's the loveliest room I've spoken in, and I've done a lot of these little presentations, not trying to sell the book. What I'm trying to do is get the ideas out. And it's so nice of you to have given up your evenings and to have listened to me amble on like that. So there we are, John. If anybody wants to attack or comment or even question, I'd be happy to take it.
Button in front of you and the microphone works. So, but then you've got to turn it off when when you finish asking your question so we can listen to Allan. And the reason for doing this is because we are filming it to putting it up on our website, and that way the people who are watching it can actually hear the questions. So thanks very much, Allan. And so, have we got any questions? We must have a couple floating around. Yes.
There should be a light on your microphone.
Okay. Allan, that was really, really fantastic pre-say on, where Australia, I was going to say where our country is, but that's bad counsel. So my question is relating to our relationship with our largest trading partner and the interference in our country that we see, particularly in the political level. My background is in the power industry and oil and gas industry, and I see now that we have a government, state and federal, that is captured by, state capture by these interests. And what I see also, having contacted recently one of your old colleagues of 50 years ago, a man called John Lander, and he was a former first ambassador to Iran and a deputy ambassador to China. And he started involved in this independent and peaceful Australia network. And, John has given a lot of information to me about the interference in Australian politics at the federal level by particularly the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, who are meddling in the affairs of government, and such that both sides of politics seem to be automatically captured. My question to you is that, China has threatened no one. They also have a policy of no first use of nuclear weapons, which, our greatest ally, supposedly, doesn't subscribe to. When are we going as a country, and how are we going as a country, to break this monopoly over our politicians? And what is the best way as we as citizens can take action to do something about it?
Do you mind if I burst into tears? Because I'm on the opposite side from Aspie, and I'm rather hoping that I do get listened to a bit, because we do have a fairly vibrant commentary community in Australia. I will agree with you that Aspie has much greater influence and has had much greater influence over the formation of security policy than I think its capabilities would suggest it should. It didn't start that way, but it has gone that way for reasons that I'm sure you're aware of the way in which it's now funded. And it's largely funded out of what I call the primes. The primes are, that's a cute word for the major defence suppliers, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, so on. And it's even funded by the State Department to do various things. My institute is not funded by any of them, nor by any public money. Where I work, and we work on the smell of the oily, well, the least oily rags you can find, I think, we're funded absolutely from small donations and 3 large benefactors. That's where our funding comes from. But this is an important point that you make, because who pays the piper absolutely plays the tune. So that if you have think tanks which are dependent on singular sources of funding, is it any surprise that the views that are expressed by such think tanks are views consonant, at least, with where that funding comes from, which is why we have foreign interference laws, why we don't want China to be able to play merry hell with our political system, to buy people off or in other ways influence them. We don't seem to worry quite so much about the United States doing a similar sort of thing. I think, by and large, the other nations with their Alliance Française and the Dante Alighieri Society, the Goethe Society, the British Council, I think they stick very, very largely to the cultural dynamic of their work. But other countries are a bit more interested in being able to win influence through our systems, and you always need to be alert to that. You'd need to be as alert to that, for instance, if I were proving myself to be a total but demagogic ratbag, because total demagogic ratbags can actually be very, very influential. And we have seen that certainly in Europe and in Britain in the course of the 20th century. So it's really a question of making sure that in those sectors of your intelligentsia, for want of a better word, but at least your educated community, in those sectors in which opinion is advanced all the time, that such opinions as are reported and given traction are at least evidence-based. I spend a fair bit of time talking to a newspaper which doesn't voice my views very often at all, but is always evidence-based in the views that it does express, which is why I read it and talk to it, and that's The Economist. And The Economist is a worthy newspaper because what it says it can argue for. Now, you can argue against it, but at least